year was 1878, and Hannah Weston believed she was already dead. She wasn't, of course. Not in the way the doctor from Redemption would sign a certificate for. But her soul? Oh, her soul had been packed into the cold, hard dirt right alongside her husband, Arthur, 2 years prior. Grief wasn't a visitor in her small cabin. It was the foundation. It was the walls. It was the heavy, oppressive silence that was her only companion on the vast, unforgiving prairie. Her life was a set of motions: wake, feed the chickens, weed the garden, stare at the wooden cross on the hill, sleep, repeat, a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence. The world was a place of muted colors and muffled sounds, a life lived behind a thick pane of glass. She was utterly, completely alone, a tiny speck in a sea of grass that didn't care if she lived or died. And honestly, most days, she didn't care either. She thought the silence was the most powerful thing on the plains, a living, breathing monster that could swallow a person whole. Then she heard the gunshot, and she realized how terribly, terribly wrong she was. It wasn't a hunter's shot. It was angry. It was sharp and ugly, a sound that tore a hole in the thick blanket of August heat. Hannah froze, her hands buried in the dirt around her potato plants. Her heart, a long dormant thing, kicked once, hard, like a startled animal in a cage. Crack. Another one. Closer this time. It was followed by voices, not the friendly chatter of neighbors, but rough, cruel shouts, curses carried and ripped apart by the ceaseless prairie wind. She scrambled up, her worn dress covered in dust, and peered over the split rail fence that marked the edge of her small world. What she saw sent a tremor of ice through her veins. 2 riders, thundering across the plains like specters of death. They were white men, filthy and hard-looking, the kind that drifted from town to town, leaving trouble in their wake. And they were chasing someone, not just someone, a child. He was a boy, no older than 10, running with the desperate, stumbling gait of pure terror. He was Cheyenne, his dark hair a banner streaming behind him, his small body straining. He risked a glance over his shoulder, and for a heart-stopping second, his eyes met Hannah's across the distance. They were wide with a fear so profound, so absolute, it felt like she was the one being hunted. The men were laughing. Laughing. This wasn't a pursuit. It was a sport. A blood sport. The boy was their fox, and they were closing in for the kill. His small legs were giving out. He tripped, pitching forward into the tall grass, not 50 yards from her fence. He vanished from sight, a wounded fawn trying to melt into the earth. And in that moment, something inside Hannah Weston, something frozen solid for 2 long years, cracked wide open. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision. It was an earthquake in her soul. The image of that boy's terrified face slammed into a faded memory of a child she and Arthur had dreamed of, a child she'd never gotten to hold. The numbness that had been her shield, her armor, her tomb, it shattered into a million pieces. She moved. She didn't know why. She didn't know what she could possibly do, but her body was acting on its own, propelled by a force she hadn't felt in an eternity. She unlatched the garden gate, the familiar creak sounding alien and loud, and she ran. Her boots sank into the dry soil as she put herself directly in the path of the 2 riders. "Leave him be," she shouted. Her voice, hoarse from disuse, was thin and reedy against the vastness of the prairie. But it was enough. It carried. The 2 men reined in their horses, their cruel laughter dying in their throats. They looked down at her, this solitary woman in a dirt-stained dress, with a mixture of surprise and contempt. The taller one, with a nasty scar that sliced through his left eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from her feet. "Well now, Garrett," he sneered at his companion, "look what we got here. A little prairie hen getting all ruffled up." Garrett, a heavier man with a bloated, sunburnt face, just chuckled, his eyes cold and empty. "Mind your own business, lady. We got dealings with this here whelp." "He's on my land," Hannah said. She planted her feet, positioning herself between them and the spot where the boy was hiding. Her heart was a hummingbird against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. But her voice, to her own surprise, was steady. The fear was a cold, coiling snake in her stomach. But something else was there too. A white-hot rage she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. "And I'm telling you to leave him alone." The scarred man, the leader, swung himself down from his horse. His movements were slow, arrogant, each jingle of his spurs a note in a funeral dirge. He sauntered toward her. "Your land? This is God's country, ma'am. And that thing in the grass ain't human enough to deserve a claim to any of it. He's the son of that murdering chief, Voken. Might be worth something. Now step aside." His name was Amos. She didn't know it then, but she would never forget it. He was the face of all the casual, thoughtless cruelty in the world, and he was walking right toward her. Hannah didn't flinch. She could feel the boy's terror radiating from the grass behind her, a silent scream that vibrated through the soles of her feet. She was all he had. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was a wall of granite. It was absolute. Amos's eyes narrowed into slits. The thin veneer of amusement vanished, replaced by pure, ugly menace. "I ain't gonna ask you again." He took another step, reaching a grimy, calloused hand out to shove her aside. He never touched her. Garrett, still on his horse, had lost his patience. He drew his pistol. The world exploded in a deafening bang, a flash of fire and smoke. Hannah felt a searing, unbelievable pain blossom in her left shoulder. It was as if someone had driven a red-hot poker straight through her body. The force of the impact threw her back a step. She gasped, a choked, wet sound, and her hand flew to the wound. It came away slick and dark, covered in her own blood. Through a dizzying haze of shock and agony, she saw Amos's stunned face turn to his partner. "What in the hell did you do that for?" "She wouldn't move!" Garrett shrieked, his voice cracking with panic and excitement. Bang! A second shot. A second, deeper agony ripped through her as a bullet tore into her ribs on her right side. This one took her breath. It took her strength. Her legs buckled beneath her, no longer able to hold her up. The sky, a brilliant, merciless blue, tilted and spun like a child's top. As the darkness rushed in to claim her, her last conscious thought was of the boy she had tried to stand for, the boy she had failed. The silence that followed was absolute. Consciousness returned in jagged splinters. Pain was the first reality, a deep throbbing fire in her shoulder and side that pulsed with every beat of her heart. The second reality was the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of her cabin, wood smoke, dried herbs, loneliness. This was different. Pungent sage, earthy leather, and something else. Roasting meat. Hannah forced her eyelids open. They felt glued shut, impossibly heavy. The light was dim, golden, filtered through what looked like a translucent animal hide. She wasn't in her bed. She was lying on a soft pile of buffalo robes. The walls around her were a cone of wooden poles and stretched skins. She was in a teepee. The realization sent a jolt of pure, undiluted alarm through her, a weak current that was immediately short-circuited by the searing pain of her injuries. She tried to push herself up, but a fresh wave of agony racked her body, and she fell back with a groan that was barely a whisper of air. "Shh! Do not move." The voice was female, low and soothing. Hannah turned her head, a slow, torturous effort. A Cheyenne woman knelt beside her, her face a mask of calm concentration. Her hair was woven into two long, silver-streaked braids, and her hands were stained with herbs. She held a small clay bowl. This woman dipped her fingers into the bowl and gently applied a cool, fragrant poultice to the burning skin around Hannah's shoulder wound. The relief was immediate, a small island of mercy in a vast ocean of pain. Hannah's eyes darted around the teepee, trying to make sense of the shadows. She saw other figures, a man standing tall and silent, his face a landscape of deep lines, his eyes dark and piercing. He carried himself with an immense unspoken authority. And next to him, peeking from behind his father's leg, was the boy. He was staring at her, not with fear, but with a wide-eyed solemnity that seemed far too old for his small face. His gaze was a confusing mixture of guilt, awe, and a deep, unsettling curiosity. Fear, cold and sharp, finally found purchase in Hannah's heart. She was alone, grievously wounded, and she was in the camp of the very people the men who shot her had called murderers. The people the town of Redemption told stories about. Dark, terrifying tales of raids and savagery. But the hands tending to her were gentle. The eyes watching her were not filled with malice, but with a quiet, intense gravity. The reality of her situation was clashing violently with the fictions she had been taught to believe her entire life. This wasn't the camp of monsters she'd heard whispered about. It was something else entirely. But what? Was she a prisoner, a patient, or something in between? The man of authority stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. He spoke not to her, but to the woman tending her wounds. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a language she didn't understand but whose power was unmistakable. He was the chief, Vulcan, and as he looked down at her, his expression was utterly unreadable. He wasn't just curious, he was judging her, and Hannah had the terrifying feeling that she was on trial for her life, without even knowing what the charge was. The days that followed blurred into a feverish haze of pain, sleep, and the healer's gentle care. Hannah learned the woman's name was Messa. She was a constant, calming presence, her quiet competence an anchor in Hannah's disoriented world. She spoke almost no English, but her actions communicated everything. She cleaned Hannah's wounds with boiled water and herbs, fed her warm, nourishing broth that tasted of wild game and root vegetables, and gave her a bitter tea that eased the fire of the fever and pulled her into deep, healing sleeps. During her lucid moments, Hannah's world was the teepee. Through the open flap, she watched the life of the camp unfold. She saw children laughing, their joyous shouts a universal language. She saw women tanning hides, their hands moving with an ancient, mesmerizing skill. She heard the low murmur of the Cheyenne language, the nicker of horses, the crackle of countless campfires. It was a world of profound community, of interwoven lives, so starkly, painfully different from the suffocating solitude she had inhabited for 2 years. The boy, she learned, was named Hunga Haka, and he became her timid, devoted shadow. He would slip into the teepee and sit silently for hours, just watching her with those old, solemn eyes. He brought her small gifts, a cup of cool water from the stream, a perfectly ripe wild plum, a single startlingly blue feather from a jay's wing. One afternoon, he pointed to his own chest. Hunga Haka, he said, his voice small but clear. Then he pointed to her. Hannah's throat was dry. Hannah, she rasped. He repeated it carefully, breaking it into syllables. Hannah. He then touched his chest and then hers, a simple, profound gesture of connection. He pointed outside, mimicking the motion of her standing between him and the riders. He used a Cheyenne word she didn't know, then furrowed his brow in concentration, searching for an English one. You. Good, he said finally. Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, hot and sharp. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had offered her an assessment of her character, not her circumstance. Not poor thing or lonely widow, but good. It was a simple, profound declaration from a child she had nearly died for, and it undid a knot of loneliness so deep inside her she hadn't even known it was there. As her strength slowly returned, the chief Vulcan came to sit with her. He was an imposing figure, his presence filling the small space of the teepee. He brought with him a younger warrior, Moavato, whose English was more practiced. For a long time the chief simply sat in silence, his gaze resting on her, thoughtful and heavy. This wasn't the empty, crushing silence of her cabin. It was a silence full of weight and consideration, a silence that listened. Finally he spoke in his own tongue. Moavato translated. He says his warriors were tracking the white men. They had stolen horses from our winter camp. They heard the gunshots. When they arrived, the men were gone. They found you on the ground. His son, Moavato nodded toward Hunga Haka, who stood near the entrance, was standing over you. He was holding a rock, trying to guard you. A wave of warmth spread through Hannah's chest, chasing away some of the permanent chill that had lived there for so long. She looked at the small boy, who now seemed to stand a little taller. Vulcan spoke again, his eyes meeting hers directly. The question was sharp, direct, and Moavato's translation was immediate. He asked why. You are not our people. You did not know the boy. Why did you stand for him? Hannah thought for a long moment, the dull ache in her side a constant reminder of her choice. How could she explain an act that had sprung not from reason, but from a place deeper than thought, from a shattered heart that suddenly decided to beat again? They were going to hurt him, she said finally, her voice still weak but clear. He was alone. No one. No one should have to be alone when they are afraid. The words hung in the air. A simple truth that was, she realized, the story of her own life for the past 2 years. Moavato translated. A flicker of something, understanding, maybe even respect, passed through Vulcan's stoic features. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate motion. He spoke again, his voice a low rumble. He says you have the heart of a warrior, Moavato translated, to stand against two men with guns, with no weapon of your own. You bled on your land to protect a son of the people. Our blood and your blood mingled in the dust. Vulcan leaned forward, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the teepee. He spoke his next words directly to her, in his own language, as if he willed her to understand them, without the need for translation. Moavato's voice followed a moment later, soft and almost reverent. He says that because of this, the council has spoken. You are no longer just the white woman who lives by the creek. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. You are Sotao. Sotao, Hannah whispered. What does it mean? It means shield woman, Moavato said. She who stands between. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. A name of honor. But Vulcan wasn't finished. With this name, Moavato continued, his voice dropping even lower, comes a decree from the Cheyenne Nation. You are now a sister to the warriors. You are under our protection. Your home is our home to watch over. Your life is our life to guard. He looked directly into her eyes and delivered the final, stunning sentence. You are untouchable. Any who seek to harm you will answer to us all. Hannah stared at him, overwhelmed. Untouchable. A sister, a shield woman. She had done one thing, one single, reckless thing. She had acted out of a desperate, forgotten instinct to defy the bleakness of her own world. She had fully expected to die for it. Instead, they had given her a name. They had given her a family. The lonely, pitied widow of the prairie had been reborn. For the second time in that teepee, she wept. But these were not tears of pain or grief. They were the tears of a long, bitter winter, finally, impossibly, beginning to break. But as the relief washed over her, a new cold thought began to form. These men, Amos and Garrett, weren't just random drifters. They knew who Hungahaka was. They called his father a murdering chief. There was a history here, a history she had just stumbled into the middle of, and being untouchable was a promise that she had a sinking feeling was about to be tested. Before they took her home, Moavato came to her again. This time he was alone. The formal atmosphere of the chief's visit was gone. He sat across from her, his expression serious. Sotao, he began, using her new name. It felt strange and heavy on her tongue. There is more you should know. The men who shot you, they are called Amos and Garrett Donovan. They are not just drifters. They work for men in your town, in redemption. Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her injuries. Work for who? We do not know the name, but we know the reason, Moavato said, his jaw tightening. They spread lies about us. They say we are murderers, that we raid settlers. It is not true. We have kept the peace treaty signed by your government, but they want our land, the land promised to us by that treaty. It has good water, good grazing. He leaned closer, and we believe it has something more, the yellow rock that makes white men crazy. Gold. The word hung in the air, greasy and dangerous. They want to break the treaty, Moavato continued. They want an excuse to bring the soldiers. Kidnapping or killing the son of the chief would be a very powerful excuse. It would start a war they believe they can win. Suddenly, the random, cruel act on the prairie wasn't random at all. It was a calculated move in a much larger, deadlier game, a game she had unwittingly become a pawn in. Amos and Garrett weren't just hunting a boy. They were lighting a fuse. Why are you telling me this? Hannah asked, her voice a whisper. Because Vulcan believes you are part of this story now, he said. Your husband, Arthur. He was a good man. He was not like the others from Redemption. Hannah's heart lurched. You knew Arthur. Movato nodded. He was a surveyor. He came onto our lands, but he came with respect. He did not carry a rifle, but a book for drawing maps. He and Vulcan spoke many times. He understood the value of this land was not just in the rock, but in the life it sustains. He promised Vulcan he would report to his government that this land was sacred and should remain with us. He was a man of honor. Hannah was reeling. Arthur had never spoken of this. He had only talked about the future, about building a life. He had kept this part of his work a secret from her. Why? He died, Hannah said numbly. They said it was an accident, a fall, down by the creek. Movato's face was grim. We do not believe it was an accident, Sotao. We believe the men who want this land found out about his report. We believe they silenced him before he could file it. The world tilted on its axis. The story of her life, the one she had been telling herself for 2 years. The story of a tragic accident, of a brutal, indifferent land taking her husband. It was a lie. Arthur hadn't been taken by the prairie. He had been murdered. Murdered by the same greed, the same hatred that had sent 2 men to hunt a little boy. Her grief, the passive, suffocating thing she had lived with, transformed in an instant. It became sharp. It became hot. It became rage. The men who had left her a widow were the same men who had nearly made Vulcan a grieving father. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was their story, and she was right in the middle of it. When she was finally strong enough to travel, they brought her home. Vulcan himself, along with Moavato and 2 other warriors, escorted her. As she rode, she saw the prairie with new eyes. The vast spaces were not empty, but watchful. The wind no longer sounded like a lament, but a whisper of secrets. Her cabin stood as she had left it, small and fragile. But when she stepped across the threshold, the silence that greeted her was different. It was no longer the heavy silence of loss. It was the quiet of a storm gathering. In the corner, under a loose floorboard where Arthur had told her to hide their savings, her hand fumbled until it found not a bag of coins, but a leather-bound journal. His journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. His familiar, neat script filled the pages, not with farm plans, but with geological notes, sketches of rock formations and detailed maps. And on the last page, an entry dated the day before he died. Met with Vulcan again. He is a good man. This valley is their lifeblood. But the pressure from Redemption is growing. Sheriff Brody was asking questions today. Too many questions. He knows I found something. He has a darkness in his eyes. I don't trust him. I've hidden the official survey and my recommendation. If anything happens to me, it's in the family Bible. The one from your mother, page 46. Forgive me for not telling you. I didn't want you to worry. Sheriff Brody, the man who had come to her cabin 2 years ago, his face a mask of sympathy, telling her about the tragic accident. The man who had organized the search party. The man who had patted her hand and told her Arthur was in a better place. He hadn't been offering condolences. He'd been confirming his kill. The floor dropped out of Hannah's world for the 2nd time in as many weeks. She wasn't just a widow. She was the widow of a murdered man. And she was living on the evidence that could expose it all. Her little cabin wasn't just a home anymore. It was a target. And the untouchable status the Cheyenne had given her, it was about to face the ultimate test. The Cheyenne warriors did not leave. They made a small, discreet camp on the ridge overlooking her property, their presence a silent, unwavering promise. It was a comfort, but it was also a constant reminder of the danger she was in. Every morning she would find a gift on her doorstep, a brace of rabbits, a bundle of wild herbs, a silent conversation, an affirmation of the bond forged in blood and sealed in a shared secret. Hunga Haka was a frequent visitor, his childish energy a balm on her wounded soul. He helped her in the garden, his chatter a mix of Cheyenne and the English words she was teaching him. He was a living, breathing reason to keep fighting. He was the future Arthur had died to protect. She retrieved the survey from her mother's Bible. It was exactly as Arthur had described, a detailed geological map marking a significant vein of gold running directly beneath the Cheyenne's sacred valley, along with his official, signed recommendation that the land be permanently protected under treaty due to its cultural and ecological significance, with no mention of the gold. He had tried to bury the secret to save the people, and he'd been buried for it. The grief for Arthur was still there, a permanent ache in her heart, but now it had a new and dangerous companion, a cold, clear purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was waiting. A few weeks later, she needed supplies. The trip to Redemption was a risk, she knew, but a necessary one. As she guided her wagon down the dusty main street, the whispers that followed her were different. No longer pity, but a cocktail of awe, suspicion, and fear. She was no longer just the poor widow Weston. She was the woman who lived with the Cheyenne, the woman they called untouchable. She ignored the stares, her back straighter than it had been in years. She was walking into the lion's den, and she needed every ounce of strength she possessed. Inside the general store, the chatter stopped. All eyes were on her. She walked to the counter, her shopping list in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then the door opened, and Sheriff Brody walked in. He was a big man, with a face that looked kind if you didn't look too closely. But Hannah looked closely now. She saw the hardness in his eyes, the slight, cruel twist of his lips. He tipped his hat to her, a folksy gesture that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Weston," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Good to see you on your feet. We were all so worried. Heard some wild stories you'd been taken in by Awakens people." "They cared for me after I was shot," Hannah said, her voice even. "On my own land." Brody's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, the Donovan brothers. A bad pair. Skipped town right after. Can't seem to find them." He leaned against the counter, his presence crowding her. "It's a dangerous world out here for a woman alone. We've been thinking, maybe it's time you sold that plot of yours. Move into town where it's safe." There it was, the offer wrapped in a threat. It wasn't just about the land anymore. He knew she'd been with the Cheyenne. He must be wondering what they'd told her, what she might know. "I'm not selling, Sheriff," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'm safer on my property than I am anywhere else." A flicker of something dark and cold passed through his eyes. He knew that she knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. The unspoken declaration of war was made, right there over a barrel of pickles in the Redemption General Store. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice losing its friendly tone. He straightened up. "But I'd be careful who you associate with, Mrs. Weston. Those savages are liable to turn on you. When they do, don't come crying to me." He turned and walked out, the jingle of his spurs echoing the sound of Amos Donovan's. Hannah finished her shopping, her hands shaking slightly as she paid. She loaded her wagon and started the long journey home, the prairie shadows growing long around her. The world felt different now. The threat was no longer a faceless greed. It had a name and a face. Sheriff Brody. A man who held the power of the law in one hand and a murderer's knife in the other. As she crested the last hill before her cabin, she saw them. Two riders, silhouetted against the setting sun. They were waiting for her on the road. It was Amos and Garrett Donovan. The sheriff hadn't been lying about them skipping town. He had been lying about where they'd skipped to. They hadn't run at all. They'd been waiting. And now they were here to finish the job. Panic flared in Hannah's chest, hot and sharp. She was alone. Miles from the Cheyenne camp. Miles from anyone. The two men just sat on their horses, blocking the path, their expressions grim and purposeful. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was an ambush. She pulled her wagon to a halt, her mind racing. There was nowhere to run. The open prairie was a death trap. Amos urged his horse forward, a cruel smirk spreading across his scarred face. "Well, looky here, Garrett. The prairie hen ain't so ruffled today. Heard you been keeping some mighty strange company." "The sheriff sends his regards," Garrett added, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "He's decided your property is a danger to the community, full of hostiles. He's authorized us to evict them. And you." It was a death sentence, delivered with a lazy drawl. They were going to kill her, right here on the road, and Brody would call it a tragic casualty in an Indian attack he himself had orchestrated. Hannah's hand tightened on the wagon reins, her knuckles white. She thought of Arthur's journal. She thought of Hunga Haka's face. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. but the rage was stronger. "You'll have to kill me," she said, her voice low and steady. Amos chuckled. "Ma'am, that's been the plan all along." He reached for his gun, and then a sound cut through the air. A sound that was not of the prairie wind or the creak of the wagon. It was a low, resonant whistle, like the call of a hawk. Amos froze, his hand hovering over his pistol. He and Garrett exchanged a nervous glance. The whistle came again, this time from a different direction, to their left. Then a third time, from their right. It sounded as if the very air around them had come alive with unseen watchers. Suddenly, on the ridge to the north, a figure appeared. A lone Cheyenne warrior on a pinto, holding a lance, silhouetted against the fading light. It was Moavato. He didn't shout. He didn't charge. He simply sat his horse and watched, a silent, unmovable sentinel. Amos and Garrett stared at him. Then their heads whipped around as another warrior appeared on a southern ridge. Then another to the east, and another to the west. Within moments, the rolling hills surrounding them were dotted with silent figures, appearing from the gullies and grasslands as if they'd sprung from the earth itself. They were encircled, not by an army, but by ghosts. Silent, patient, and utterly deadly. The hunters had become the hunted. The bravado drained from Amos's face, replaced by a pasty, sweaty fear. He looked from the warriors on the ridges to the lone woman in the wagon, a woman who was no longer alone. He saw not an easy target, but the center of a web he had blindly stumbled into. Movato raised a hand, not in threat, but in a slow, deliberate gesture. He pointed a single finger, first at Amos, then at Garrett. Then he drew that finger across his own throat. The message was clear. "We know who you are. We know what you did. And there is nowhere on this earth you can run where we will not find you." Amos spat on the ground, a gesture of pure, terrified defeat. He yanked hard on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. He and Garrett dug their spurs into their horses' flanks and galloped away, not back towards redemption, but east into the vast, darkening plains, swallowed by the very wilderness they thought they commanded. They did not look back. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She looked up at the ridge. Movado raised his hand one more time. In a slow salute of acknowledgement, Hannah raised her own in return. She was Sotao, the shield woman, and her family had just saved her life. But as she watched the Donovans disappear, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had survived the henchmen. Now she had to face the monster who held their leash. Sheriff Brody would hear about this, and his next move wouldn't be with two hired thugs. It would be with the full, self-righteous fury of the law. He would come for her, and he would come for all of them. The news of the Donovan's flight spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. But the story Sheriff Brody told was very different from the truth. He stood on the steps of his office, his face a mask of sorrowful duty. He told the townsfolk that the poor, traumatized widow Weston had been fully turned, that the Cheyenne had bewitched her, that they were using her cabin as a forward base for raids. He claimed the Donovan brothers, whom he painted as concerned citizens, had ridden out to check on her and were brutally chased off by a war party. He was a master liar. He played on their fears, their prejudices, their greed. He spoke of protecting their women and children, of securing their future. He was calling for a posse, a legal sanctioned mob to ride out to Hannah's land, wipe out the hostile threat, and rescue the poor woman who had lost her mind. But Hannah knew the truth. He wasn't coming to rescue her. He was coming to erase her, and to get his hands on Arthur's map. The Cheyenne knew it too. Their watch on her cabin intensified. Moavato explained the situation grimly. "He will come with many men," he told her. "They will carry the flag of your law. For us to fight them would be to declare war. It is what he wants. It would bring the army. We would lose our homes, our land, everything." "So you'll do nothing?" Hannah asked, a cold dread seeping into her. "We did not say we would do nothing," Movato corrected her, a hard glint in his eye. "We said we would not declare war. Vulcan has a different plan." For the next 2 days, Hannah lived on a knife's edge. She watched the road to redemption, waiting. She slept with Arthur's old rifle by her side, the journal and map tucked securely in a leather pouch. The silence of the prairie was gone, replaced by a tense, humming anticipation. On the morning of the third day, she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, a long, dirty plume rising into the blue sky. It was them, the posse. She stood on her porch and watched them come. There were at least 30 men, armed with rifles and a self-righteous fury. And at their head, riding tall and proud, was Sheriff Brody. He had deputized the entire town's fear and greed. They reined in their horses 100 yards from her fence line, forming a long, intimidating line. "Hannah Weston!" Brody's voice boomed across the clearing. "You are harboring violent hostiles. We are here under the authority of the law to remove them and ensure your safety. Send out the savages and come with us peacefully." Hannah's heart hammered, but her voice was clear when she called back. "There are no savages here, Sheriff. Only the men who saved my life from the murderers you hired." A murmur went through the posse. Her words had planted a seed of doubt. Brody's face darkened with fury. His plan for a simple, clean rescue was falling apart. "She's out of her mind. They've twisted her. We're coming in." He gave the order, and the line of men began to move forward, a slow, menacing wave of steel and dust. Hannah raised Arthur's rifle, her hand steady. She wasn't a warrior, but she was Sotao. She would stand between. She fired a warning shot into the dirt in front of Brody's horse. The animal shied, and the line faltered. "Next one won't be in the dirt, Sheriff," she yelled. Brody's face was purple with rage. "She fired on the law! Open fire!" But before a single man in the posse could raise his rifle, a new sound filled the air. It was the sound Moavato had described. Not a war cry, something far more chilling. From the ridges, from the gullies, from the tall grass, the Cheyenne rose. It wasn't a handful of warriors this time. It was the entire nation, hundreds of them. They appeared as if by magic, lining every rise, their faces painted, their lances and bows held ready. They were silent. They were still. They didn't make a sound. They just watched. An army of silent ghosts, a ring of judgment surrounding the posse. The men from Redemption stopped dead in their tracks. Their blustering anger evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of being hopelessly, completely outnumbered. They looked at the lone woman on the porch, then at the silent army in the hills, and the story the sheriff had told them suddenly seemed very, very thin. Brody was screaming, his authority crumbling. "They're bluffing! They won't attack! Fire! Fire, you cowards!" But no one fired. No one moved. They were trapped. And then, from the center of the Cheyenne line on the main ridge, a group of riders came forward. At their head was the stately, imposing figure of Chief Voken. Beside him rode Moavato. But they were not armed for war. Voken was carrying a peace pipe, and Moavato was leading a horse with a man tied to it, gagged and bleeding. As they drew closer, a collective gasp went through the posse. They recognized the man. It was Garrett Donovan. Moavato rode forward and cut Garrett loose, dumping him in the dust at Sheriff Brody's feet. "This man has a story to tell," Moavato said, his voice ringing with authority. He held up a blood-stained pouch. "A story he was paid to keep quiet, but my warriors are very persuasive." He pulled the gag from Garrett's mouth. The man was trembling, his eyes wide with terror, not of the Cheyenne, but of Sheriff Brody. "Tell them," Moavato commanded. "Tell them the truth." Garrett looked at the stony faces of the posse, at the silent army in the hills, and at the sheriff's murderous glare. He broke. "He hired us," Garrett blubbered, pointing a shaking finger at Brody. "He hired me and Amos. Said he wanted to scare the Cheyenne, start some trouble. He wanted us to grab the kid, and he told us if the Weston woman got in the way, to get rid of her." The confession tumbled out, a torrent of desperate truth. He wanted her land, always has, just like he wanted her husband's. The men of the posse turned as one, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fury. They looked at Sheriff Brody, no longer as a leader, but as a liar and a manipulator who had used them. "And what about Arthur Weston?" one of the townsmen demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Garrett was sobbing now. "Brody did it. I heard him bragging about it to Amos. Said Weston found gold on the Indian land and was going to protect it. Brody pushed him down by the creek, made it look like an accident. He murdered him. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The truth was out, raw and undeniable, laid bare in the dust between two worlds. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of cornered hatred, drew his pistol. But he didn't aim it at the Cheyenne. He aimed it at Garrett, the only man who could testify against him. He never fired. An arrow, swift and silent as a whisper, flew from the ridge. It struck Brody in the wrist, sending his pistol flying into the dirt. He screamed, clutching his hand, his reign of terror over in a single silent shot. The posse didn't hesitate. They surged forward, not as a mob, but as instruments of justice. They grabbed Brody, pulling him from his horse, their faces filled with a disgust reserved for a man who had betrayed every trust. Chief Voken watched, his expression unchanged. He had not started a war. He had not shed blood, other than that of a guilty man's wrist. He had simply brought the truth into the light and allowed it to do its work. Hannah stood on her porch, Arthur's rifle hanging loosely in her hand. She watched as the men she had been prepared to fight disarmed the man who had been their sheriff and tied him up. They were looking at her now, not with suspicion, but with a deep, shame-faced respect. They had been led astray by a monster, and she, the woman they had come to condemn, had shown them the truth. The silence on the prairie had a new sound now. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of peace. She looked up at the ridge, at the hundreds of warriors who had stood ready to die for her. She looked at Voken, who gave her a slow, respectful nod. She looked at Hunga Haka, who was smiling, a wide, joyous smile. She was Hannah Weston, the widow. But she was also So Tao, the shield woman. She was a sister, a protector, a bridge between two worlds. She had lost everything, only to find a new family, a new purpose, forged in violence and sealed in honor. The sun warmed her face, and for the first time in a long, long time, she was not just surviving. She was home. The story of the shield woman became a legend on the plains. It served as a stark reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about standing for what's right, even when you're standing alone. Sheriff Brody was taken away, and the truth of his crimes brought a reckoning to the town of Redemption. The peace treaty held, strengthened by a bond that was deeper than any piece of paper. And Hannah Weston, So Tao, lived out her days on her small patch of land, forever watched over by the family she had earned with her blood and her heart. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of hidden history and unsung heroes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let me know in the comments what you think. Could one person's courage truly change the course of history? Thanks for listening.